Hello and welcome to this PLSA Academy webinar on buyout ready administration. My name is Daniel Taylor, I'm Client Director at Trafalgar House, and over the next 30 minutes we're going to be asking the question, what steps can be taken to prepare your scheme for a buyout? Now, even if your scheme's not yet in a funding position that will allow a buyout to take place, the tools and processes we're going to discuss today will still have a real life benefit for administration services and operations on a day-to-day basis. So there should be some real life benefits even if funding to buyout is not yet within reach for your scheme. So today's agenda is going to include us looking at today's buyout market and the benefits you can unlock by starting your buyout process now, the three main phases of a buyout process from an administration perspective, and what information needs to be provided to the insurer, what exactly we mean by buyout ready data and how this differs from some of the other standards and benchmarks that are used to assess data quality, the key stages of transitioning to a buyout process. We'll also look at some of the common data rectification projects that can often flow from out of a buyout process. And then we'll round this off by looking at some of the procedures and processes that can be addressed to simplify some of the key administration processes to make it ready and aligned to the requirements of an insurer. So before we start looking at the process itself, I'd like to use this opportunity to set up the case of why it's important to start looking at your administration in the context of buyout requirements as soon as you possibly can. And there are two key reasons that you should really be doing this. The first is the buyout market itself. As the DB market continues to mature, most pension schemes are now actively considering the ways that they can transfer risk into the insurance market. And whilst activity has been slowing in 2016, largely due to the continued fall in bond yields, which has made this type of transaction less favourable. Indications are that 2017 will be a bumper year for the buyout market, and we'll see the trend of 2016 reversed as many more schemes engage with this type of policy. At the moment, the insurance market continues to have capacity to acquire and complete this type of contract. But demand for maturing DB schemes could quickly exceed all capacity in the market. So schemes that are well prepared, have considered the issues around entering into a buyout contract, can have a competitive advantage in what is potentially going to become quite a congested market over the next 10 to 15 years. The second reason is to do with operational risk and reduction benefits that following a buyout transition process will bring to your scheme. And by that I mean that if you work through the processes that will be followed to get you to a buyout, even if you're not in the buyout ready situation from a funding perspective, your operation will be a lot more effective and de-risked, and in fact your liabilities will be far more closely matched to your ongoing funding plan. I'm going to expand on this point a little later on. So what makes for an effective buyout process? Now, if you speak to anybody who has had contact or been involved with a buyout process, then they're going to be telling you that there's three key ingredients that make these processes really successful. The first, unsurprisingly, is really effective project management. And by this, we mean project manager that's going to oversee every single stakeholder within the process, not just administrators or the insurers. And having somebody that ties that all together will really add a lot of benefit to the process. The second one is pace, and how quickly schemes can move from an initial pricing position to making a decision about the transaction to then completing it with the insurer. There's a big risk for trustees when they're considering a buyout process that the market volatility or changes in funding can change between pricing and when the transaction is actually completed. So moving with pace, once the decision's made to go to a buyout is incredibly important. And then the third really important point, and unsurprisingly when we're talking about administration in the buyout market, is the quality of data. Making sure that you've given consideration to all the different elements and aspects of administration data that's required for a buyout process. Now, I appreciate that most schemes would have already done something in terms of data, maybe even just met the minimum requirements in terms of common data. But when you think about the buyout process, the level and depth and range of data that's required for that is significantly more stringent than the standards that you may have already been considered. I'm going to explore those standards in a bit more detail today. and really look at why buyout administration data is significantly different to any other type of data analysis that you may have completed in the past. So before we move on, I just want to quickly look at the three key buyout stages. So as you'll see from the slide, we've crudely represented the process within three main stages. The first one is pricing. This is the stage where trustees approach the market to understand the cost of the buyout from a live insurance market. The second one is the transaction stage, where the agreement is made with the insurer and the process formally starts to move the liabilities from the scheme over to the insurance company. And this can take between 6 to 9 months to complete, and as you'll see from the slide, easily involves the most work. The final is the actual buyout stage. This is when all records and liabilities transfer across to the insurer. And as I said, the greatest amount of work that schemes are required to do is in terms of the second stage of the process, the transaction stage. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today. But I do want to make it clear that, however, if trustees should not wait for all of the work to be completed within this second stage before deciding to approach the market for pricing. For the pricing stage, trustees only require a reasonable standard of basic data, and by that I mean no obvious holes in terms of the underlying liabilities. Data does not have to be perfectly clean before trustees approach the buyout market, approach insurers to get a quote. If you wait for that to happen, then you may miss market opportunities in terms of pricing, but also you may never actually get to the position where you feel your data is in a good enough position to get pricing. So you might ask the question, if you don't need perfectly clean data to get pricing for your scheme, of why you would bother going down this process now and not just waiting until the time is right. Well, there are some very good reasons, both from an operational perspective as well as from a long-term strategy perspective, that you should start this process as soon as possible. The first one is quite an obvious one. So the more accurate and clean data you have, the more accurate the pricing will be from the buyout provider. Also, you might find that between the transaction stage of this process and the full buyout stage is that if your data materially changes between those 2 points, then the buyout costs could materially change. So starting the process right at the beginning, as soon as you can, will mean that anything you get in terms of pricing will be more closely matched to the final buyout premium at the end of the process. The second, the next very important point is around you matching your liabilities and your funding plan more exactly. So if you follow the process that insurers follow for a buyout, even if you have no plans to actually buy out the scheme in the short term, then what you can do is make sure that the liabilities you're funding are much more closely matched to your funding plan. And as we go through the process, you'll see that there's a number of steps and processes within the process that will reveal if your funding is not aligned to your liabilities. And then the final one is making sure that you are ready, you're market ready, in a more competitive buyout market to seize on the opportunities when they present themselves, either in terms of the deal or in terms of your long-term funding plan. So my advice is don't wait. Start this as soon as you possibly can, and as soon as certain trigger points happen within your scheme. A very obvious one is scheme closures. There really is no reason to wait. And then from an advisory side, you may also find that the longer you give this plan, the longer your project plan is, then the lower costs your advisors will charge, your administrators will charge for getting you to that full buyout position. A premium comes with time, so the less time you have to complete this, the more cost and the more expense this process is likely to cost. So what do we actually mean by buyout ready administration? I suspect most trustees will already feel that they've gone a long way to address some of the data or process issues for their schemes. But as I mentioned in the introduction, the requirements for buyout are far more stretching and comprehensive than anything you may have encountered before. From a regulatory position, schemes and trustees have probably already completed most of the basic checks in terms of data. This is referred to as common data. Other schemes may have gone a little further and gone to the next level of data assurance by completing more comprehensive conditional data checks. And these look more closely at underlying liabilities. But buyout-ready data goes far more further than any of those two standards. Buyout-ready data requires that you not only establish the completeness of data, so those conditional checks, but requires you to approach it from a completely ground zero position. You will be required not only to check if your data is present, and full, but also check that the data itself matches the scheme rules. To put this another way, most other tests that administrators perform, at least in some part, rely on the accuracy of past calculations. So they rely on the crystallised data that you've already got secured on the records. But BuyOut Process will demand that you ignore crystallised liabilities and recreate liabilities based on a first principles basis using scheme raw data. So on the next slide here, you'll see how we've shown the different layers of data analysis and data quality from an administration perspective across those three levels. Right at the heart of the process is common data, the most basic checks. The next layer up is in terms of conditional data, looking at underlying liabilities, and then overlapping that and encompassing and including all those checks is also the buyout level of data preparation. And as you'll see, it includes conditional and common data, but it goes a lot further by including things like audits, reconciliations, and rectification programs as well. It's very uncommon for administrators to approach any data accuracy project from an entirely first principles basis. The times that you may find this is where a scheme is transitioning from one administrator, one provider to another, or where a specific targeted benefit assurance program has been commissioned by the trustees. But in most cases, administrators will rely on past data to perform future calculations. Data audits you may have already completed will probably not be recreating source data, but will be attempting to check accuracy based on crystallised benefits. And those crystallised benefits were probably calculated at the time the member left or when they retired. You'll see from this slide that buyout process starts from a ground zero position. The process starts with a full legal review of the governing documentation, and then using this, the assurance programme then builds up to a full benefit audit, followed by data audit, and then an eventual rectification plan. Nothing is assumed as a given. Nothing is accepted as gospel. Key to the first stage of this process, though, is the completion of the legal review. And we're going to look at what that process includes and the benefit it brings to the administration process and later data audits in a little more detail next. So the purpose of a full legal review is to look at the entire legal history and operational practice of the scheme. Its aim is to establish if everything that was intended to happen actually did, from checking whether deeds have been properly executed, to making sure that rule updates or amendments were actually followed through into administration practice. And what they're trying to do is to check that the legal framework actually flow through to real life process and administration and data management for the scheme. So just like the approach taken to data, a full legal review assumes nothing, and it requires a full root and branch review of all of the scheme's rules. It's commonplace for this process to uncover a number of issues that have often been assumed to be closed or finalised by trustees. And you'll often find that because rule changes were acted upon or not, and then not correctly reflected in the deed or properly executed, then there can be a disconnect between administration operation and the rules. And over recent years, I've seen two examples of where there's been a fundamental disconnect between the governing rules and the operation of the scheme. And in these two cases that I've seen, it could have easily derailed the buyout process because it resulted in some significant additional liabilities. The first case was when a historic rule change enacted a change in accrual basis that actually wasn't executed within the deed. And that required that the trustees honoured 2 or 3 years additional accrual at a higher rate, obviously increasing liabilities and obviously increasing the buyout cost. The second was a case where the scheme had assumed a change to CPI had taken place, but the legal review uncovered that RPI was still actually the revaluation method that the scheme needed to use for its deferred members. And again, this resulted in increased liabilities and obviously resulted in an increase to the buyout premium. Now, thankfully, in both cases, the increased liability did not stop the buyout from completing, but this could have very easily derailed the process had the liabilities been a lot higher. So the lesson we can take from this is that your funding plan could be targeting a liability on an ongoing basis that is different to the buyout cost. And so by completing a full legal review and benefit audit now, you can be assured that your targets and plans are fully aligned. So now I want to look at the next stage of the process and how benefit audits compare to data audits. Data audit is easily the most common type of assurance test trustees complete, but they're not always aware of the existence or advantage of a benefit audit. As I mentioned earlier, benefit audits are designed to understand and validate the liabilities from a first principles basis. Data audits are designed to look for gaps and comparators within the existing data set. Both have a place and a role to play, but if you start with a benefit audit, then you can establish exactly the type of data your pension scheme needs and should have, and then you can base your data analysis on the requirements of the benefit audit. Benefit audits, though, in the main are sample-based. Unless you want to spend a lot of money recreating every liability in the scheme from scratch, then it's impossible to apply benefit audit universally across all of your members. So benefit audits tend to target very high-risk key records to establish a consensus on the overall liabilities using sample methodologies. Data audits are far more comprehensive in their application and should be applied to every record across the pension scheme. But the key fundamental difference is that benefit audits are intended to prove that benefits have been calculated in accordance with the trust deed and rules. Data audits are intended to establish that all data expected and required for a scheme is present. There are two fundamental differences in the approach. Benefit audit is to establish the liability, data audit is to establish if all the data is there. So, a benefit audit is intended to prove that benefits have been calculated in accordance with the trust deed and rules. And a data audit is intended to prove that all of the required data is complete and present. It doesn't necessarily tell you whether the figures populated within the administration records are correct. That's what the benefit audit is designed to do. The success of a benefit audit relies on how accurately you can predict where problems might arise in your record set. Because it's a sample-based system, you need to think about the risk profile of your membership and adjust your audit sampling based on where you think problems might arise. A good benefit audit should target records based on the severity of the risk and the number of members that are exposed to that type of risk. On the slide here, you can see some common examples of risks of varying types and the real focus that a benefit audit should place in terms of rating them. So the examples show a range of common risks from change in accrual and benefit equalisation events to things like if the member has a transfer in or an underpin, but also if there's been any structural changes to the scheme, change in administration, or operationally whether you know there's gaps in the service, so whether there are no automated calculations. Once your benefit audit work is complete, you can then move into the various levels of data audit. As I mentioned in the introduction, you've probably completed some or all of these tasks within the common and conditional data framework. But please bear in mind that if there are material differences uncovered through the benefit audit in terms of the structure and the layout of your liabilities, then you will need to retest all of your conditional data, because obviously the assumptions that you are making about those tests will no longer apply if the underlying liabilities are materially different. At the end of your data audit, what you should be left with is a pretty comprehensive report that shows you where all the gaps and inconsistencies are with your underlying data. You can then work with your administrator to design and implement a data rectification plan based on the results of the data audit. But getting these processes in line and working through them methodically is key to the overall success of this project. Unless you complete your benefit audit first, then you may find yourself replicating some of the work that's required in the data audit. So make sure you establish the liabilities through the legal review, the benefit audit, and then once those two stages are complete, then turn towards your data audit. If you start with your data audit, you may find that when you recast the liabilities, you will need to repeat that process from the beginning. So getting those in order is absolutely essential to managing costs, but also getting you to the buyout position as quickly as you possibly can. And I would just want to look at some of the other essential data projects that may not be uncovered from your data audit or your benefit audit. But they're always givens in terms of what the insurer or the buyout provider will require from most schemes. So once you've identified any gaps or inconsistencies through your audits, your insurer will obviously want you to work to fix the issues before the liability is transferred to them. And as I said, this process can take between 6 to 9 months. But in addition to that, there are some very common examples of data projects that you will also need to address. The obvious one here is GMP reconciliation. And then flowing out from that, it's likely that your insurer will want you to do some work in terms of GMP equalisation as well. So completing that process as soon as you possibly can, the reconciliation is important. But other projects can also include reconciling third-party AVC accounts and existing insurance contracts. And what that means is you are getting hold of the policies from the external AVC provider and making sure that those records match your administration data. You'll also want to look at checking the existence of your entire membership base. Now, most pension schemes only complete mortality screening for pensioners. But of course, when you get to the buyout position, you don't want to be securing any unnecessary liabilities. So it's well worth completing a full mortality screen across all of your deferred population as well. And in my experience for sizable schemes, you're likely to see a good handful of liabilities in there that you needn't be insuring. So making sure you complete that process is absolutely essential. Also, any pension scheme knows now that just in terms of good general data management, you should be keeping on top of your contact information for your members, but this becomes especially important through the buyout process. So make sure your common data is to a really high standard and you've done everything you can in order to trace all of your scheme members. So finally, I just want to look at one other area of buyout administration, and this is an area that's sometimes forgotten or missed. I want to look at buyout administration from the procedural side of things and how some thought should be given to how easily your insurer will find matching your administration process to their buyout policy, and indeed how easy it is to administer the policy on an ongoing basis. And there are two common examples of this that I see come through. The first one is pension payment dates. Still, some schemes have multi-date payrolls, which means that every pensioner within the scheme will get paid on the date that they retired or originally left. This is very complex and it has quite a substantial overhead in terms of administration operations. And your insurer might find it difficult or would even want to bid for a piece of work where each liability, each pensioner is being paid on a separate payment date. So looking at that and seeing if there's opportunities to reconcile payment dates will have a good operational benefit as well as a benefit for progressing the buyout process. You will need to take some further advice on that because any change to payment dates may have an individual tax implication for your members. The second area that's also related to that is pension payment increase dates. So checking the scheme rules to see if any payment dates can be rationalised to make the ongoing administration simpler. Work with your administrator on those points. Ask them if there's any opportunities to simplify process or operations, and inevitably that will have a beneficial effect when you're engaging with the insurance market. So, in conclusion, my advice is to start the process as early as you possibly can. Don't wait until you're ready for buyout. Take the initiative as soon as you can. Especially if your scheme's closed, now is the time to start looking at this process. Complete a full legal review of your documentation as soon as you can. I know it's expensive, but it's well worth the time and the investment. Risk profile your membership records and understand where there might be gaps or problems within your population. And then start to complete a benefit audit and data audit processes. Even if you're not close to buyout, this process will give you more certainty over your liabilities and will enhance the administration service. So, thank you for your time. I hope you found this presentation useful. We're now going to open up the floor for any questions you might have.